Okay, here we go. I guess we can shut the door. Okay. All right, so now we're recording. I'm going to talk about what is probably the most exciting field of genealogy in the United States today, which is African American genealogy. Discoveries being made every day, mostly because of the Georgetown Project, for those of you who are familiar with that, tracing the descendants of slaves that were sold by Georgetown University into Louisiana in the 1820s. And this has opened up, I think, a lot of eyes and a lot of avenues about what's possible in terms of African American genealogy. It used to be, you know, we'd get back to 1870 and slavery, and then we'd say that was it. You know, everyone was slaves, and then they were suddenly free, and that's where it starts. Well, it turns out there's older records, there's things that we can do before 1870, and I'll talk about why 1870 is such an important date here in a minute. So what we're going to do today, we are going to outline the special research techniques African American researchers should be aware of, and that's mostly going to be going through records, because a lot of this isn't indexed, a lot of this is only now being discovered, or being discovered in terms of its value for African American research. And we're going to talk mostly about the record collections and databases that we can help locate African American ancestors before 1870, what's out there, what's available, what kind of information is available on these records, and how and where to find them. We're going to consider the limitations of African American genealogical research and ways to work around them, which is just, a lot of that is just good genealogy. And then we're going to talk at the same time about what's available here at the East Baton Rouge Parish Library, which goes with the second objective. So, how to start your research. If you have not started your research, if you're just starting your research, I recommend don't start looking up names and dates until you've gone and talked to your family or your friends or your neighbors. This is important, first of all, just because you should be doing that, because your family is important. But also, there's information there that you may not be aware of that's in your family's oral tradition that, and you know, the classic example of this is Alex Haley, but you know, I cite this example from my own research that I wish I had done this before. My grandparents died in the late 90s. I only just discovered that my grandfather went to high school in Little Falls, Minnesota, which is the same high school that Charles Lindbergh went to. So my grandfather went to high school with Charles Lindbergh, probably knew Charles Lindbergh, at least by sight. And I didn't know this. I never had the opportunity to talk to him about it. I wish I had, you know, and that's gone, 20 years gone. So talk to your family members, talk to the old timers, talk to different ones because they may have different information that was told to them or different views and perspectives. Also, your family probably has, and I know we have lots of floods here, so things disappear and get destroyed. Photographs, Bibles, letters, anything like that. Thank you. You know, if you have a photograph in a frame, take it out of the frame and flip it over. Often there's something written on the back that's valuable information. You know, these sorts of things. And you can sort of put together a who, what, when, where, at least a starting compilation of stuff that you can work from this way. And I recommend it just as a way of, you know, being with your family. Okay, and then you want to organize your research. And this is basic stuff. Some of you are a little more advanced. But you want to figure out, okay, this is what I know. What do I want to know? You know, I know when my great-grandfather died. When and where was he born? What kind of person was he? Where did he work? You know, these sorts of questions might be interesting to ask as part of family history. And then based on those expectations, figure out what the best resource is. This is basic library science too. Figure out what the best resource is to discover that information. If you want to know where he lived, look for him on census records. If you want to know what his profession was, look for him on census records. You know, did he appear in the newspaper? Was he involved in anything? These sorts of things. And then, of course, think realistically. And by this, I mean, work your way back a generation at a time, one step at a time, as you work your way back. Don't try to say, because I have people frequently come to me and go, my grandmother told me we're descended from X famous person. Can you prove it? That's not how it works. Work your way back. If X famous person is back there, you'll find them. Don't try to associate yourself with people, because you'll force things, and then the truth will get lost in that. There's some examples of that from my own past. One of my mother's maiden aunts did a genealogy way back in the 1920s, and it turns out, according to this genealogy, we're related to the Wright brothers, Buffalo Bill, Grover Cleveland, all these people who were famous at the time. Turns out none of that is true. So she was trying too hard. So don't do that. Go with the facts, go with the truth. I promise you it's more interesting. Okay, so for those of you just beginning, ways to keep track of your progress. This is called a pedigree chart. And basically the way it works is you begin here by writing your name here, and then put your father up here, your mother down here. Father always goes on top, mother on the bottom. Father's father, father's mother, mother's father, mother's mother, and list the women by their maiden names, because we're tracing families here. So if you put the maiden name here, and then the father's name here will make sense. And and this also lets you see what you know and what you don't know. So if you can look at these and you can say, well, I don't know the name of this great-great-grandparent. This is a person I should be looking for, etc. So, and they come in different layouts. And there's some that are online. Family Search that I told you about, you can put one up there. It's collaborative. And so other people can go in and mess with your stuff, which is a great thing, because people can go in and you can share your research. And it's also terrible because anybody can go in and share your research. And I've had people mess with my stuff. So anyway, if you're expanding your pedigree chart and you want to do like a larger family tree, a way to do that is by using family group sheets, in which you write the name of the parents, the children, facts about their lives. And I'll show you a slightly better one. This is from my own family. This is a simplified one, but this gives you the idea. These are my great-grandparents, George A. Shepherdson, G-A-S, there is an unfortunate initials, and his wife, Edith Shell. We've got their birthdays, and we have their death days, and where they lived, where they were born. And I still don't know how this woman from Somerset, Pennsylvania, wound up marrying a man from Paxton, Illinois, living outside of St. Louis, but it's for another day. And then it also lists their children. So there were 3 siblings. The first one you see here was stillborn, born and died on November 2nd, 1902, when Edith, by the way, was 39. So she got married late. And then there's my grandmother with the basic facts about her life. And then my grandmother's little sister, Rosina, and some basic facts about her life. And I still don't know. I know she got married because grandma wouldn't shut up about it. My grandma was a spiteful woman and would say, oh, I got the husband and she got the property. And then she got married. And that blew my grandma's mind. So I know she got married, but I don't know where or when or to whom. I haven't found that record yet. But that's a family group sheet, and that sort of expands on, that sort of expands on what you know on the pedigree chart. So, and then research extracts. You can use one like this if you want. I keep a notebook. So when I'm looking for someone, just like where I've looked, what I've looked for, when I looked for it, things I want to go back and look at again. And it sort of keeps you from going over the same information over and over and over again. If you forget what you're doing, if you put somebody down, which is a research tip I recommend. If you're looking for something, you can't find it, set it aside for 6 months and come back to it. There'll be new records coming on, or you'll maybe have a new perspective. And this will help you keep track of what you look for, when you look for it, what kind of information is there, or just keep a notebook. So let's talk a little about the genealogy research cycle. Once again, this is basic genealogy. And, this is just a continuing loop. So we're going to start with review what you know about your family. So if you're looking for somebody, where were their children born? When did their children live? Where did their children go to school? Decide what you want to learn. Where did my great-great-grandfather, what did he do for a living? Where did he go to school? How educated was he? Whatever. Locate records using all available resources. So which means knowing what's available and how those records are kept. Work backwards in time without skipping generations. Once again, logical procedure, step at a time. Evaluate your findings, develop new questions. Okay, now I know where he went to school. How educated was he? How far did he go? Why did his parents put him in that school, etc. And then, ask, go deeper. Who, what, when, where, how did this happen? And the most basic thing we use is census records. And for African Americans, this should, quotation marks, get you back to 1870, which is when the slaves, for Emancipation 1865, the first census to include slaves by name was 1870, former slaves by name. Census is taken in every year ending in 0, so every 10 years. It's in the Constitution. You got to do it. I hope all of you all take the census. You all did it, right? I was an enumerator, walking around neighborhoods, banging on doors, trying to get people to do it. So thank you. I only got threatened twice. Okay, starting in 1850, every citizen of the United States would get their name listed on the census. Slaves were not legally citizens of the United States. That whole 3/5 of a person thing. But that meant 1850, that meant everybody who had a house, wives, children, the whole thing. But prior to that, up to through 1840, only the head of household got their name listed. Typically the man, sometimes a woman, but usually the man. And then everybody else would appear as a tick mark on the census record. So there'd be a column, boys 5 to 10, tick, girls 5 to 10, number 2, okay. However, before 1870, free people of color are listed on the census. They are counted as citizens. They are listed on the census. Their families are there. All that information is there. So when you get your family back to 1870, don't just stop in 1870 and go, there were slaves before that. Maybe not. Try to find them in 1860. Try to find them in 1850. Maybe they were freed before that. So this is what a census record looks like. This is just part of it. It shows, like I said, every 10 years they take the census. This is how it's listed. It shows a snapshot of what a family looked like at that 10-year period. Who was living together in the household? So what you want to do is you want to find the head of household, and you can see these numbers here. This shows the number of the household and the actual location. So some house had 2 households in it at some point. And then you're going to find this word head. And then everybody else is listed in relationship to the head of household. So here I have the head of household, Perry Clausen, Elizabeth, his wife, their sexes, male and female, their race, and we'll talk a little bit about race on the census in a minute, ages, and then every census asks different sets of questions about family relationships, education levels, etc. And on the 1910 census, which this is, they asked, which marriage is this for you and how long have you been married? So that's what this M1 is, and then 36 and 5. So here we have the head of household, his wife. Interestingly, we have the son-in-law listed next. So Opha L is the daughter of pairing, which is great for me because that gave me a maiden name for her. And she's married to Victor E. Michael, and they have a son, Victor C. Michael. And that explains where that C comes from, Clausen. His middle name was Clausen. And it lists their ages. So that's my grandfather here, Victor. And he's 2.5. So he was born about 1907. And then we have approximate ages for these people. So now if I want to look for their birth records, I can, go back and say, okay, well, if he's 57 in 1910, that means he was 47. He was born in 1853, approximately. Right? And then, and also in the 1910 census, I can also know where to start looking for marriage records based on age. So there's a lot more on the census than just the names, but the names are paramount. That's going to put together who's related to who, how they're related, and then you can use that information to start looking for other information. And it's just a matter of reading and interpreting. So the 1870 census is the most important census for African American genealogy because it is, like I said, the first one to list former slaves by name. So, also in 1870, it was only 5 years after the war, after Emancipation, people hadn't started to move around very much. Some were moving, families were regrouping, like if, a man and his wife was sold to a plantation 2 doors down, he may have moved, that's starting to happen. But for a lot of times, people are still living as free people where they were enslaved. A lot of people still are there. So the 1870 census is good for that. And you will find on a census, and I don't have an example here, you will see like a whole list of people, the letter B next to their name for black. And then if you go back a page or 2 pages, there'll be a rich white family. That's a pretty good indication that was the slave owner that owned at least one of your ancestors. Not always, but that's a good place to start. Okay, so also proximity to neighboring families. So, you'll see families appearing next to each other all the time. And that's a good way to say, okay, well, these, and they'll be intermarrying because, once again, plantations were fairly closed systems. So if a man is looking for a wife, there's only 40 people there. He's not allowed to travel to other plantations and look, you're going to find family relations living together. Uncles, aunts, cousins, everybody just sort of in one place. And their location may help determine if they were enslaved or free. If they're living with that whole group, like I said, the whole group of black, and there's one white family, that's a pretty good clue that they were enslaved. If they're in a city, or in a town, and there's white families around, that's a pretty good indication that they may have been free people of color. Not always, but that's sort of, if you just think about it logically, that's kind of how it works out. So let's talk for a minute about free people of color and also the 1840 census, which this is. This is Baton Rouge in the 1840 census. And as you can see, it's just heads of household, and then everybody else is a tick mark. But if you look down here in the bottom left-hand corner, you'll see these little initials, FMC, and let me focus in on that. FMC, free man of color. So in Baton Rouge, in the 1840 census, they lumped all the free people of color together. FMC, there's an FWC, free woman of color. So the head of household, there's a woman. Sally Mathers. So now this does not give you any indication of where they were living, because they just all got put together. Now some of them probably were living, because I know, because I've done this research, that there were like 2 neighborhoods in downtown Baton Rouge where free people of color were living, but this doesn't give you any idea of how they were related to each other or where they were living. They're just names. And because I like to complicate things, and because race history is not a simple thing, if you count up 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12 from the bottom, you see this guy, John Tallis. On the next page, under slaves, we count up 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12. He's a free man of color. He owned 6 slaves. So there's a story there. I would love to know what that story is. And maybe I'll put that in my notebook as the next thing I'm going to do. But so yes, people of color own slaves. And here's right here on paper. So you might want to look into your family if, I don't know. So while looking at census records, keep in mind the classifications of race changed from census to census. So in 1940, for example, you have white, Negro, Chinese, Japanese, Indian, Filipino, Hindu, or other race. But if you go back to 1890 is not a good example, 1870 and 1880, you have white, black, mulatto, Chinese, and Indian. And this was all based on the census taker, what he saw or she saw. 1960 was the first census where there was a mail-in form and the people filling out the form could choose their own race. Before that, the census taker would knock on your door and just choose for you. So a person might appear as black in 1880, and then as Negro in 1930, or as mulatto in 1900, or it can be the same person with different classifications. So just keep that in mind. It's based on what the census taker saw, what he thought he saw, how much he cared. Because we found like people who are Native Americans being listed as black because the census taker just saw a dark-skinned person who was like, it's black. So yeah, and that confuses things. Also names checking, I'll get into that. Okay. So what if there is no census record? The most recent census available is 1940. The census keeps personal information private for 72 years, which means next April 1st, the 1950 census is coming out. I know I'm excited about that. I hope Cassie might be too. A lot of information is going to be on there. But so 1840 is the most recent census available. What do you do if there are people you're looking for before 1940? How do you get back to 1940? Well, a big one is obituaries. Person dies, the family puts information in the newspaper. More recent obituaries or have more information. The farther back you go, the less information there is. Go back to even the 1970s, there's just a paragraph or two. And now everybody gets a shout out. Husbands, wives, dogs, cats, best friends, the whole thing. So the problem is, especially if you're using Baton Rouge and New Orleans obituaries, because of Jim Crow, the newspaper does not start printing obituaries for African Americans until about the early 1970s. Before that, nothing. You got your name in the paper if you died in a particularly gruesome way. Some way that was going to move papers. Other than that, nothing. City directories are an excellent resource for locating people and relations, and I'll show you an example of that in a minute. You can get them on Ancestry, or we have all the Baton Rouge editions upstairs, all the known ones upstairs, and you can look for, it'll list, and I'll show you in a minute what it lists, but person, maybe a spouse, job, and where they lived. And then newspaper articles. Like I said, if somebody died a particularly gruesome death, was involved in a car accident, they may have their name in the paper. I found one family because he had been arrested at age 17 and yet got his name and address in the newspaper. He was an African-American boy. And then I was able to find that address in the city directory and then connect him to his mother, who was living at that address with him. So newspaper articles, even though there aren't obituaries, even though African Americans were not typically covered in the newspaper, they'll still pop up, usually under unpleasant circumstances. So, okay, so obituaries are available in Newsbank, which we have in the digital library. You can fully searchable all the way back to 1840s. The Baton Rouge and New Orleans papers are fully searchable. Other newspapers, and as I said, obituaries commonly list parents and siblings. And even though there wasn't an obituary published, say, before 1870, if you have like an elderly person who died in the 1980s and it lists their mother, then, you know, if the person was 80 years old and died in 1984, that person was born in 1904, and the listing of the mother, now you've gone back to somebody probably in the 1880s was when they were born. So you can move back generations if you really pay attention to what you're doing with obituaries. The information can be there, just might be harder to suss out. We also have access online to the Baton Rouge News Leader, which was an African-American newspaper. It's published mostly in the 60s and 70s. They're in the digital library. Publication is sporadic, our collection is sporadic. Nobody really collected them, so a lot of them just vanished. But they're there if you can find them. And it's, you know, it's a pretty good resource. Also, just if you want to look at like what was going on in the African American community while, you know, the larger civil rights movement and history and Vietnam and all that was going on. So this is what a directory page looks like. And before about the mid-1960s, if you see right here, we have the letter C after a person's name. That stands for color. So African Americans were individually listed, and it was noted that they were African American. And we have city directories. They've been published regularly in Baton Rouge since about 1928. Before that, it was very sporadic, 1905, 1896. But they will list African Americans. And as you can see here, this is James O'Connor. He's a driver. There's his wife. And there's his address, 938 North 28th. So where was he living? What was he doing for a living? Who was he married to? So now if you're going to look for the marriage records, you're going to look for maybe gravestone records, etc. You know who to look for. Right. So here's Joseph O'Connor. I don't know what a doorman is. He's white, so he's not, but he lives on South 21st. And you'll notice North 28th, South 21st, give an indication of where the dividing line was in that region. All sorts of weird and interesting things you can find out. So I don't know what this number means. I think that's years at that address. So I looked through it, I didn't find it. But if you're having a hard time finding a person or finding their relationships, city directories are a great place to look to figure out who they were, where they were living, who they were married to. And this can get you back to 1940. Another great resource is death records. Louisiana death records are sealed for 50 years, 50 years. And then by the time they're processed and put online, it's more like 51 or 52. But you can find them at the Secretary of State's website. Or you can find the index of them at the Secretary of State's website. You write down the information you find there. You go to the state archive, and for 50 cents, you can print off a death record. So this will tell you, but you can find here, if you see the year, the person's age, the month and day they died. But then you can take the information here. It also tells you which volume they're in and the page number. If you take that information, you can get the death record. If the person died under 50 years ago, you're going to have to figure out where the death record is kept. Price goes up considerably to get one. $35, I think is what we're charging now. And, you have to prove that you're a relationship. Anyone can look at the older death records, anyone. Newer death records, you have to be like grandparent, grandchild, brother, sister, parent, that sort of in that direct linear thing. So you may not be able to get more recent death records. And what is on a death record? This is actually my great-great-grandmother. She died under the name Mary Cochran. She was born with the name Catherine Schumacher. There's a whole bunch of stories there. But it will tell you names of parents. For example, Frederick Schumacher. Maiden name of mother, Schmidt. Notice it doesn't list the name for some reason. Whoever reported, and that would be her son from her first marriage, Louis Schoenberger, didn't know his grandmother's name for whatever reason. It tells you what they died of, which if, probably good information to have, to know what kind of health problems to look out for yourself, especially if you see things appearing over and over again. Where they were born, where their parents were born, and where they're buried, who handled the body, etc. All that information, it's on pretty much every death record. Louisiana death records aren't much different from this. So they're really good for connecting people if you don't know who the parents were. Find a death record. There's a chance that the parents will be on the death record. If not, you'll know when and where they died, and the funeral home that took care of the body, etc. So those are really good to have. Origins of African American family names. Once again, a complicated issue. Who knows? Honestly, when it comes down to it. So surname of family member's former owner, sometimes not. Names of respected historical figures, often. I mean, after the Civil War, after Emancipation, you can name yourself. What would you do? I had found a case where a man had one name, and then he went and found his father, and his father had another name, so he changed his name to his father's name, just like that. So, family tradition. Slaves did actually have, at least in their own minds, last names, a lot of them, and those got handed down, and suddenly they just crop up. Nicknames are occupations, people named Baker, Butcher, whatever. And like a case that I had mentioned earlier, surnames that change by family association. So, they're living here and they're using one name, they find the other side of the family living somewhere else, and they change their name to that. Also, be careful because, and I'm working on a case right now of a woman who was born in slavery. She starts using one name, then she just out of nowhere switches it to another name, and then she doesn't marry the man, but she has a child with the man and starts using his name, and then goes back to her first name. So, so it took about 2 generations after Emancipation for names to sort of settle down and become regularized. Some of them right away, some of them, who knows? So tracking people can be difficult because names are changing, which is why we have the FAN principle. Family, associates, neighbors, FAN, the FAN principle. So if you're trying to find somebody and their name is changing, but you know the names of their children, look for their children on the census. Look for people with those names in that particular order on the census to find a person. So if there's a person named Mary and she's got children named George, Mary, and Steve, look for George, Mary, and Steve, and you can probably find Mary. Associates. We were working on a case for a guy who had graduated from pharmacy school. We were trying to figure out which pharmacy school he went to. Well, he had a person that he opened a business with, he was good friends with. So, we couldn't figure out what pharmacy school one went to, so we started looking for what pharmacy school the other one went to. Did we ever find that?
We haven't yet.
Oh, we haven't yet. Okay.
Still digging.
Okay. But that's how you do it. Like your core friend group, unless you move around a lot, which I have, doesn't change much. Right? So neighbors will stay neighbors. I have found people in my own family by looking for their neighbors because I have a weird last name. It's often misspelled. recorded funny, but they have neighbors with normal names, so I look for the neighbors with normal names. Things like that. So be open-minded, think strategically, try to find, other people who are associated with this person and trace their history. Right. So alternate spellings of a name. For example, I have an ancestor named Romer, and I can never find them. So I started looking, well, what letters look like R? K. I look for Comer. I look for B, for Bomer. Those are where I actually found them, etc. So spouses and children's names already mentioned. Established neighbors I've already mentioned. Or if you get really desperate, you might have to, what we call, read the tract. That is, start with the first page of the census tract where you know they're living, and scan down the page for the last name. Go to the next page, scan for the last name. The next page, scan. Yes, it's tedious. But when you find it, trust me, yeah. Okay, so tracking ancestry to emancipation. I've pretty much covered this. Use the standard methods that I've talked about to get back to 1870. Try to locate your family in 1870. And then see if you can find them in 1850 and 1860. Maybe they were freed before that. You don't know. If you can't find them, it's a reasonable assumption that they were enslaved, and then we're going to have to go to a different set of circumstances to try to find them. You may not. 1870 might just be where it is. So we're going to talk about census records, which we've talked about some, but we're going to talk about the additional slave schedules and mortality schedules. A little bit about the plantation records. That's a whole other class because they're so complex. Court records will have people. Wills. The owner dies, he leaves his property, people were property, so people will be enumerated in the will. George, age 28, man, light-skinned, his 2 children, will be listed in the will, and then, right over the horses. Property sales, if you can find those. Large-scale property sales. If you bought 400 acres, often you would buy the people that went with that, and they would be listed in the property sale. Notarial records, which I have just discovered, and the Baton Rouge ones are not indexed, and I'm so angry. When people did large business transactions, they would go to a notary public, and they would have the notary draw up the contract, and it would list what was being sold and the terms of sale. So, if somebody's buying 3 slaves from another person, they would go to the notary would, lots of legalese, wherewith thereunto, forthwith on the 4th day, etc. And they say, we're buying these 3 slaves. Boom, 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 and then the terms of the sale. So, and then the Freedmen's Bank and Freedmen's Bureau also. So, a slave schedule. In 1850 and 1860 censuses, when they started recording everybody's name, they would also record this. Like, this is the slave owner here. And then these are the people he owned, listed by sex, age, and that's it. But if it's a small enough scale 1 and you're pretty sure that that's your slave owner, then you might be able to determine. But this is, or whether like the name you're associating with your person was a slave owner. And then you'll know where to look in property records and notarial records for that person. Mortality schedules. These are from the 1860 mortality schedule from Baton Rouge, Louisiana. The slaves are all listed with the owner's name. And you can tell they're slaves because, there's the sex, B for race, B and M for race, S for slave, where they were born, when they died, what they did for a living, and what they died of. And these are all belong to Laycock. These are all people who worked right here on this land. Laycock was the Goodwood Plantation. So by the layout. These are people who lived and died right where we're standing. And you will notice several children died of thrush. So they had a thrush outbreak, which is sort of bad. And back in the day, if you got it, well, especially if you were malnourished and poorly cared for. So you can see, and these only record within a year of the census date. So if this is 1860, these are people who died late 1859, early 1860. And he had 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7 people die. 7 slaves died. But we have names. And, so we'll tell you, what you might be able to associate a name with a person. Also, it's just horrifying. Probate records I talked about. A person dies, a significantly wealthy person dies. They go and they do an inventory of his property for his heirs. His property includes human beings. They will be listed by name. It won't just say 12 slaves. It will list them by name, age, approximate age, and maybe a brief description. And those are available on Family Search and on Ancestry. A little easier to use Ancestry, a little more complete on Family Search. And if you're looking at Family Search, and we can show you how to do this, they're not indexed. But you have to go, if you're using Family Search, this will make sense. You go in, you click on records, and then a map of the world will show up. You click on the United States. A drop-down box shows up with the names of all the states. You click on Louisiana. You got to click your way in. It's pretty deep. And then you can go find the parish you're looking for, and then find the different records available for that parish. And then you have to start going through them. But like I said, Family Search has a huge number of records that aren't indexed. You have to browse them, but they're there, and they're really, really good. Okay, we're going to talk a little bit about the Works Progress Administration. In the 1930s, the WPA, under the New Deal, sent people all over the South to find ex-slaves in the 1930s, so 70 years after Emancipation. So we're talking old people. Or they also sort of said, well, people born before 1870. We're going to let children of slaves born before 1870 also in on this. So there's a lot of those. We have a selection on our digital library. There's a category under, if you look in the digital library, there's by subject, African American, and genealogy. And then there's slave trade records and collections on microfilm. Those are difficult to use. That's for another day to go into depth on how to use those. And then also enrollment applications for the 5 civilized tribes, the Dawes Rolls, which are for Native Americans, but there's a lot of intermarrying going on. So you might be able to find an African American ancestor on the Dawes Rolls if they married into a Native American family. So this is a really fascinating one. The Race and Slavery Petitions Project, you can just Google that. It is a collection of basically slaves suing their owners for emancipation. Like the owner told the slave, on such and such a date, I'm going to set you free, and then doesn't. And now the slave has to petition the court to be emancipated. This happened a lot. Slaves are constantly petitioning because, well, first off, the way the law worked, if the mother is set free, the children are supposed to also be free. But often the mother would be set free, the children held back. So those children would sue the owner, say, hey, look. They would have to find a lawyer and do all that stuff. Extremely difficult, but those records are there. And those are online, those are free, you can access those from anywhere. You don't need a library card. We have plantation records on microfilm, like I said. I think I have almost all of the ones from Louisiana. Plantation records will include all kinds of things. Inventories, What's the word I'm looking for? Just like today, we bought 12 barrels of sugar and 6, and a harness for the horse, stuff like that. Very boring. You have to kind of go through them. But there's also diaries, letters, gossip. I found a ketchup recipe at one point. Somebody had written down just randomly on a piece of paper the recipe for ketchup, and it wound up in there. And those continue on both before the war and after the war, because, the plantations didn't go out of business. They kept going, just having to pay their labor or try to find ways to get out of paying their labor. Records will, if you're lucky, if you find what plantation your person was on, and those records are in there, and East Baton Rouge Parish is way underrepresented in these records. Washington Parish might have better luck. But there will be inventories, once a year they'll go out and go who's working for us? Well, who do we own? Maybe he's going to make a sale. Maybe he has a debt he wants to pay off. Maybe he's going to buy some equipment and he needs to put slaves up as collateral on a loan, which also happened. So you have to make a list of the people. Yeah. And when I think about what I'm saying, I'm horrified. Just keep that in mind. I'm just glossing over that. And if you can find diaries and letters, they will tell daily life on the plantation. And those will also include names and what's going on, how they lived on the plantation. Slave manifests, particularly in Louisiana, because life here was brutal and hard, people were importing slaves from typically the East Coast, Virginia, North, South Carolina. Slave traders would go up, buy slaves, put them on a ship, bring them down to New Orleans, offload them and sell them there. So there are slave manifests. They would be listed on a manifest, just like you would list all the cargo on a ship. Like I said, notarial records also have these. This is a New Orleans slave manifest. These are available in Ancestry. If you go into Ancestry and you click on card catalog and write New Orleans slave manifests, and then there's a search bar, you can look for names. And this is one such slave trader, and this is from 1850. And here they are listed, and you'll notice last names. Abraham Barron, George Hill, John Riley, William Garrett. They all have last names. This is an amazing resource, especially for people in Louisiana. Also with a description. Abraham is 25, he's 6 feet 4 inches tall. I'm sure he probably went for a lot of money. So, yeah, last names. So if you have a slave with a last name, say in 1870, and it says they were born in North Carolina, South Carolina, Virginia, that area, try to find a slave manifest with that name on it. That might get you back a little further. And this just has the name of the person, of the slave trader. Sometimes it'll be the owner of the plantation going and buying slaves. Sometimes it'll be a middleman. And then they would offload off the ship, put them in the jail in New Orleans, and then the owners would come pick them up. And because in 1850 the railroads in the South weren't that great, it was much easier to put people on a boat, sail them around Florida, and take them up to New Orleans. There's this really fascinating thing, the Transatlantic Slave Trade Database. It does not have the names of, mostly the names of the people transported. It does go into the voyages, where they were coming from, all that. And there's a fascinating animation, if you can find it on there, that shows all the ships every year, where they went, where they sailed from, where they sailed to. Brazil, the Caribbean, the United States, Bermuda. Because after importation of slaves from Africa was made illegal in the United States in 1807, they still got around it by importing them from the Caribbean, or from Bermuda, So slaves would be brought from Africa, they'd be shipped to Bermuda, and then people would sail from South Carolina over to Bermuda and buy African slaves and bring them over. That was legal. Direct from Africa, not legal. And let's talk about WPA Slave Narratives. Now, the problem we have with those Okay, we have them upstairs in a huge multi-volume set, and they are indexed. Indexed by name of slave, name of owner, where the story was, excuse me, where the story was collected and where the person lived. And like I said, these are older people. Louisiana is not in the main collection. The Louisiana set of these narratives is available through Southern University on their website through the library. So if you want looking for somebody from Louisiana, the first place you want to start is Southern University Library. And they are talking to these old people about what life was like when you were a slave and shortly after. And they provide lots and lots of valuable genealogical information. For example, this guy is talking about it's the end of the Civil War, and they're from Shreveport, and the owner's making a run for it. But he talks about my mom, my dad, my brother Jimmy, my sister Betty, Pappy's name was Charlie, Mammy was Sally. So there's excellent genealogical information. So, like I said, these were collected in the late 1930s by Alan Lomax, who's also collected all the folk. If you listen to the folk music collection, he also did this with slave narratives. Oral histories of ex-slaves and their children born before about 1870. So slavery and slavery adjacent people. Keep in mind they're old. They're also available at the Library of Congress website. The Library of Congress website is a nightmare sometimes to use. It's very difficult, but we have them in book form upstairs. And we have the old edition and the new edition. So there's an older edition, and they found a bunch more, and they put them in the newer edition. Like I said, we're not in the main collection. Louisiana's not in the main collection. There are slave narratives about Louisiana, but they're people who left the state. So people who were in Little Rock, as I'll show you in a minute, or Texas, or Ohio even, had their narratives collected from Louisiana. And this is one such narrative. The woman's name is Elizabeth Hines. She's living in Little Rock, Arkansas in about 1938. And this is just an amazing, amazing amount of information. I was born January 10th, 1868 in Baton Rouge. I came here. I can't read or write. My brother-in-law told me that I was born 3 years after the war on January 10th. So that puts her, what, January 10th, 1868. My mother's name was Sarah Clody. My father's name was Square Clody. I don't remember the names of my grandpeople. Yes, I do. My father's mother was named Bertha because I called my daughter after her. And then I can't make this next sentence out. I can't figure out what she's trying to say. She must have been in the Square family because that was his name. So she talks later about his military service, and I think I found out who that was, and his name wasn't Clody. But he had a different name. I'm pretty sure I found out who it was. I have 4 brothers and sisters. 3 of them I don't know anything about. I've never seen them. My sister, Rachel Fortune, suckled me on her breast. That is her married name. Before she was married, her name was Rachel Bennett. Her father and mine was not the same. We was just half-sisters. So she's got an older half-sister who nursed her. We have the same mother, though. And now, why is this interesting to me? Because at the bottom of this page, I don't know the name of my mother's old master. Yes, I do. My mother's old master was named Laycock. Once again, right here, where we are standing. He had a great big farm. Now, on the next page, she talks about what an absolute jerk this guy was. Laycock. At the time, at the end of the war, he was building a gas house, so he could have natural gas, so he could light the fields, so he could work the slaves after dark. And then at the end of the war, put the kibosh on that. And she says that was the hand of God moving there. I can believe it. But based on the information in there, and I've been trying to find descendants of people who were enslaved here, and I have not been able to, but based on that information, there is Rachel Fortune on the 1880 census, married to Solomon Fortune, which she talks about. That's her brother-in-law, who told her when she was born. And then they have a son named James. So that information is good. Now I have a key to get into finding the sentence. So I'm really, really happy about that. So if you can find a WPA slave narrative, those are gold. Not everyone has one. The Freedmen's Bureau, 1863, after the Emancipation Proclamation, as slaves are moving across the Union lines to freedom, there's suddenly millions of people who cannot take care of themselves, have no income, have no land, have no way to make money. So the Congress sets up the Freedmen's Bureau to provide, and after the war, food, legal representation, contracts. So if they're going to work for their former master, they had to now have a contract. So you're going to pay me on this date, and you're not, they would write these contracts. Legal problems would all be taken through the Freedmen's Bureau. So a lot of names between 1865 and 1870 show up in Freedmen's Bureau records for the first time. There's also the Freedmen's Bank, which is exactly what it sounds like. It was a bank set up for African Americans, newly freed slaves, where they could start banking, saving money, earning interest. And in order to sign up for that, you had to provide your name, where you were born, often the name of the former owner, and then there'll be like a little life history or something. The Freedmen's Bank, I think, went under in the early 1870s. Once again, not everybody shows up there, but that's a good place to look. And this is an interesting story I found in the Freedmen's Bureau. This is the story of a man named Prince Durant, and other freedmen, but he lived in Port Hudson. Now keep in mind, this is 1867. This is 2 years after the war. His daughters are still on the Woodside Plantation in Jackson. His 2 daughters. 2 years after the war. He's living in Port Hudson. His daughters are on the plantation. He goes with some armed men to get his daughters. So that tells you a lot right there about what's going on. The former owners just hasn't got it through his head yet. He gets his daughters, he leaves, the owner gets the sheriff, they track him down and arrest him and take the daughters there. And then they get the mayor of Jackson to say, oh no, the daughters belong to Mr. Woodside. So this is a whole legal case. It's all described here with Mr. Durant's name, the names of, I'm guessing Woodside is his former owner, because why else would his daughters be on that plantation? But there is a happy ending. Here's the 1870 census. There's Prince Durant and his wife Eliza, and their 2 daughters, Rose and Catherine. So he ultimately got them before him. But he appears for the first time in the record in that 1867 story, filing a suit against his former owner. And they also have a son since the war. So there's all sorts of streams. We have the African American Heritage Database. This is available through the digital library. And it has, links to all kinds of stuff. I recommend looking at Afrogeneus, which is a collection of African American research and family histories and so on. And the newest addition to the family, just last week, Black Life in America, through Newsbank, a collection of mainstream newspapers, particularly from the South, and then after the Great Migration, we're talking about Chicago and New York, plus African American newspapers, all fully searchable. All fully searchable. The original article, boom, right there on the screen. So if you're looking for a name, if they did something, if they were reported on birth, marriage, death, especially if they were in large cities, and a lot of the large cities also reported on, after the Great Migration, what was going on in the South. So I have found articles about school graduations and elementary school festivals in New Orleans, and I found them in Chicago papers because there's that connection, that immediate family connection. So this is an excellent new resource. We're just now trying to figure out what it can do for us, but I'm hoping it'll open up a lot of doors for us. And then finally, and DNA, which is a complicated issue in itself, and that's another class that Cassie's going to be teaching in May. But there are particular DNA websites and companies aimed at African Americans. They're more expensive because of the kind of DNA testing they're doing. You can do an ancestry test, and that'll tell you about, you'll get that sort of ethnic breakdown, like what part of Africa you're from, and all the list of all these people that you have genetic relationship to, which is excellent tool. Don't get me wrong. I recommend doing the legwork and the paperwork first, and then getting a DNA test, which may blow everything out of the water. Think very carefully about why you're doing it and what you're doing before you take a DNA test. I have had people. There was a woman, and she's from West Baton Rouge Parish, and her mother's family was all there, but none of her father's people were there. But this random guy from Shreveport starts showing up. Uh-oh. Her man who raised her, she discovered, because she took a DNA test, was not her father. Her mother had a child by another man. So that potential is there. Just be aware of it. Okay, so the kind of testing they're doing for the African Ancestry site is they're doing mitochondrial DNA testing, which traces your mother's side, because that's a chunk of DNA that you inherit only from your mother, and it remains relatively unchanged over time. Thousands of years time. And then for men, there's also Y DNA, which men inherit from their father, also relatively unchanged. And this can locate very precisely, in terms of DNA precisely, hundreds of miles, where your family comes from. It's more expensive. It's more involved testing. So as we're winding up here, let's talk about what the limits are. Okay. Family units are not stable. Part of Jim Crow racism in general, white supremacy, is destabilizing the African American family. Economically, legally, so it can happen. Families are getting broken up. People are being raised by aunts, uncles. This is very common. And it can make your research very difficult. You're trying to find the parent of a child who's being raised by his aunt or his grandmother or the neighbor. Okay, names of spouses and children could change due to multiple common law marriages. I was talking about that a minute ago. This woman she changed her name a couple times. She has children by one guy and by another guy. And then some of them have her name and some of them have his name. And it's this complicated mess of trying to figure out who's who is whose child. Racism prevented fair access to recording authorities. So I have found, even with death records, which are supposed to be kept in Louisiana, and starting in about 1918, there's people way after that who died who don't have a death record. Either because somebody didn't go and tell somebody, didn't know to tell somebody, nobody cared. So I am finding marriage records, though, are pretty good. But even then, like, people would just get married and not officially record it. And records for the majority of slave families simply do not exist. Or if they're listed just by first names. So you don't know. So for a lot of cases, 1870 is going to be the limit. Or, people who are living in 1870. So if somebody's 80 years old in 1870, you're back to 1790, but nothing else. That's it. So you have to accept the fact that because American history is what it is, it just may not be there. It may not exist. Nobody wrote it down, nobody recorded it, nobody kept it. All right. So if you want to get started, we do have books. These are check out. And there's many more besides that we have upstairs. But these are some good places to start. Also histories, like there's a great history of the Great Migration that just came out a couple of years ago that has a lot of names and details in it. Okay, so some things we have. Catholic records are not on here, but the Catholic Church in Louisiana made Catholic slave owners baptize their slaves. So there is a book up there of people baptized without surnames. Also, if your family was Catholic, there may be records after that. So. All right. Oh, and military records. There is this is where I was looking. There's a website that's run by the National Park Service. In it, there's a database of every known soldier in the Civil War, soldier and sailor. And that's where I was looking to find Mr. so-called Clody. So, yeah, so that's a good place if you think somebody served in the colored troops, as they were called. That's a good place to look, maybe find some family there. Okay, so winding up. How to contact us. This is my last slide. This is the end of it. I'll take questions for a few minutes. We are located here on the second floor of the main library, right up there. Our phone number, 231-3751. That rings the main desk. You can email us, and it's really easy to remember, genealogy@ebrpl.com. And if you send it one to Genealogy, that shows up in all of our inboxes. All right. So, I'm David Laatsch, and that's my Martian last name there. So nobody ever spells it right. So I recommend if you want to get in touch with me, Genealogy is far easier to remember. EBRPL, East Baton Rouge Parish Library, EBRPL. That's all you have to remember. All right, and then Cassie, 2 years now?
Yep.
2 years now, it's been working with us.
Next month.
Yeah. And John, particularly if you're Baton Rouge, he's an old Baton Rouge person. And so he knows he's got in his head a lot of Baton Rouge history. He's a good person to talk to. Cassie's from Pennsylvania, I'm from Ohio. We're learning this as we go. All right. Do we have, let's see if I can get out of here. Any questions? And I'll throw this open to people, anybody who might be at home and may want to send in a question through the chat. Do we have any questions? Anybody questions, comments, concerns? Is there anything I didn't cover that you want me to talk about? Anything I covered too much you wish I would shut up about? Anything? No? Okay. Well, that's what I have prepared. So I thank you all for coming. I hope you've learned something. I hope I've maybe inspired you a little bit. And that's it. That's all I have. So have a good day.
Thank you.
Appreciate it.
Are you going to post a presentation on the library website?
Yes,
Okay.
we are going to do that. Yes, we're going to stop recording right now. Okay.
Let's have another, who watched Bonnie? Would you know approximately, it looks like they do this research how long normally, I'm sure it's different for different people, different circles, but just kind of in your experience, when people start to see finding stuff, finding names, finding connections, what's the what's, I guess, an average time frame? I don't know if that's a loaded question, but.
Yeah, on their schedule is about a year. For them, because I know because they've asked us to do research. I won't tell us something. Who the guest was. Yeah, they make it. I used to work for a carpenter. This makes sense in a second. And he hated Bob Wheeler. Because Bob Wheeler would go, go to Norm, be like, hey, Norm, what's going on? Norm's like, well, I'm gonna take this new door we found, and I'm gonna stick it right here, make this house better. And they're like, okay, we'll be back. And then 10 minutes later, they come back, and Norm's like, hey, look. And that's how I feel sometimes about finding your roots.
Yeah.
It's like, oh yeah, we went to this archive in Mississippi, and we found this piece of paper with your great-grandfather's name on it. Well, first of all, people who work in the archive do that, and second of all, who knows how many
How long they look, yeah.
So like a lot of these resources, you have to go to the place, you have to find the thing, and then you have to.
Because they make it like a crime is solved in 1 order in an hour.
Yeah.
Exactly.
That's the feeling I get when I watch that show. It's like, it can't be that easy.
I always tell people that if it was as easy as they made it look, or as easy as the Ancestry commercials made it look, we wouldn't have a job.
Yeah.
Right.
So,
Yeah, there was a woman who came in one day, it's like, oh, I've got Saturday afternoon free, I thought I'd do my genealogy. And we just laughed and laughed. Because yeah, I mean, when I started out, I got my great-grandparents in a hurry. I was thinking, I see, these records are there, and they lived in cities. But beyond that, I've spent years looking for immigration. Well, I'm not doing just that, but I look for it. So it's like, back, through hours, probably about 12 hours worth of my time, just to find this one thing. So.
and you may have different luck with different branches. You know, with your mother's father's side of the family, you might roll right through it, and with, you know, your father's mother's side, you might get 2 generations back and just stop.
So be patient, come back to it.
Yeah.
Because new records are coming along all the time, new things are being discovered, people are getting involved in the game and putting new stuff up, which is I recommend you join Family Search, because Family Search is collaborative. So you get your family tree on Family Search, anybody can go in and add stuff. That's the great thing about Family Search. The bad thing about Family Search, anybody can go in and mess up
And they will.
days of research that you've done because they don't like the fact that there's a cousin marriage back in your family. So.
Or they desperately want to be related to Benjamin Franklin, so they're going to try to shoehorn family trees together, even though his mother was dead when their grandmother was born.
Yeah, I had a Mayflower person try to connect me with a Mayflower person, and they were born after, like 2 years after their mother died.
Yeah, because they just so desperately want to make that work.
Or you win if you have Mayflower. Yeah. So yeah, be careful. Also be careful and read everything, even the original records, read them with a critical eye. Because they're frequently wrong. I have one of my grandfather's uncles is on the 1920 census, even though he died in 1911. Yeah.
I appreciate y'all doing this.
Yeah.
This presentation, because I think for a lot of, Black people in America, I think there was a lot of pain and a lot of, thoughts of how our ancestors were treated. But it's also good to know that a lot of them have great stories that seem to come about in our own lives, right now, finding people who do the same job that you're doing, same interests. So I appreciate this information.
Yeah. And if you watch Finding Your Roots, that does come up a lot. Like a lot of the people, you think, Africa, slavery, freedom. That's the story.
Yeah.
Not always. I mean, there was one where somebody was born in Haiti and then married a guy, and then after the Haitian Revolution, she came with her white husband to New Orleans, and they set family there, and so this. And the person was always told, don't work this descendants, as well no. So, yeah, I think, and that's why I said this is like the most exciting, cutting-edge field in American genealogy right now is African American research. We're finding that the stories are there. We have to work for them, but they're there. And it's, the knowledge of what slavery was and who the descendants of slaves are, how slaves were treated and recorded is changing. It's really exciting. And that'd be a tiny little part of it.
Yeah, it's still very.
Yeah.
So when you start recording, whether if I wanted to use the family group sheet, like the one that you saw on there,
Mm-hmm.
we would have pages and pages of it, because you would have the father and the mother and the children,
Mhm.
and then you go to the next uncle or aunt and all of them, and so you just what, to
Yeah.
staple them together or whatever? 'Cause you
I-
can't make a long sheet.
I
because
have,
you
I have
from
file
here to
folders.
Goodwood.
I have file folders for each branch of my family. I also do most of my stuff online. There's Roots Magic, which is a free downloadable software you can keep track of stuff on.
What's it called?
Roots Magic,
Roots Magic, okay.
and also Family Search will do that.
We also do teach an organization class. Mr. John usually teaches it, genealogy, digitization, and organization. So that might be a good class for you too, that talks a little bit about different ways you can organize your research,
Okay.
whether you're a paper person or a digital person or a hybrid of both.
And there's no right way to do it if it makes sense to you. And if, you know, that's.
Well, thank you so much.
Well, thank you all for coming.
Yeah.
I'm sorry about all the technical difficulties.
Okay.
We're still learning this new thing, and I'm going to say if we'd been in the tech life like we're supposed to be, this would have gone smoothly. All right. You all have a good day. Thank you so much.